The kingdom of Alada grieved as the king died and his two sons fought over the throne. Eventually, these sons met a stalemate and agreed to leave the kingdom and form their own kingdoms elsewhere. One brother had no trouble founding his kingdom, while the other was gifted lands from tribes. This was not enough for the young prince, and he demanded more. Offended, a tribe leader Dan came to personally refuse the offer, stating, "Should I open my stomach and build a house for you there?" He was killed on the spot. And where he was killed, the young prince would build a great palace and name it Dahomey, meaning inside of Dan's stomach. The kingdom of Dahomey began conquering villages surrounding them, expanding their rule. At the same time, they encountered some Europeans with the British, Portuguese, and Dutch, where they began their slave trade. The Dahomey would become one of the most prominent sources of slaves in the region. The kingdom of Alada would have a war of succession, where the Dahomey would offer one side military aid. They used this as an excuse to be able to march upon their capital. Both sides were quickly vanquished, and the kingdom of Alada incorporated into the kingdom of Dahomey. The allies of the Alada would become involved as well, but also defeated. After conquering all of these lands, the king of Dahomey would move his capital to the city of Alada. The Dahomey thirst for conquering was not over though, as they declared war on the Oyo Empire. But, as these two nations clashed, a civil war broke out with the Dahomey, as a former royal family in the conquered territories returned to their home and declared themselves independent. The Dahomey diverted a large portion of their army to deal with these rebels, while the rebels thought that their oppressors would be too distracted and too weakened by the Oyo Empire to fight back. So when they saw the greatness of the army coming to face them, they ran. The diversion of these troops did cement the defeat of the Dahomey, and they became a tributary state of the Oyo. Although, they did maintain domestic control, and controlled a significant amount of territory, while also keeping their relations with the European traders. Under the Oyo Empire, the Dahomey experienced a political struggle between a faction that rose up against the royal family and the royal family. The faction was eventually defeated, and around the same time, the capital was moved back to its original place in Abhomi. Their overruler, Oyo, saw the success that the Dahomey slave trade had, so they put restrictions upon their trade so that more European customers came to their doors. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, since the slave trade was the economic backbone of the Dahomey. So, they amassed an army led by a man named Gezo and marched against the Oyo. This army won the liberation of the Dahomey and named Gezo as their ruler, but Gezo, the humble man that he was, renamed the Dahomey Empire to the Gezo Empire. But the locals still considered themselves Dahomey, and the international community did as well. And just when they thought they were in the clear, the English, who had recently abolished slavery, had asked the Dahomey to limit their slave trade. The Dahomey obviously rejected, but out of fear of English threats, they began to sell palm oil as an alternative. Dahomey now lost a war against a city-state, who declared themselves as a safe haven for all those who feared enslavement. This incited major political changes, as two political factions formed: the Elephants, who were slave trade supporters, and the Flies, who wanted an expansion of the palm oil industry. But the Dahomey's worst fears were realized when the British blockaded their ports and forced them to end their slave trade. The Dahomey suspended their military raids for slaves and their slave trade for a time, but due to internal pressures from the Elephants, they resumed these practices. During the scramble for Africa, the Dahomey king gave the French control of the city of Kontu. But once this king died, his heir had more of a disdain towards the French, and this new king sent raids against the French in their protectorate states in Africa. These raids sparked the French-Dahomeyan Wars. The Dahomey lost these wars and became a French protectorate state, eventually being absorbed into French West Africa. The French built a lot of infrastructure and began many public services, but they assimilated the locals into the Roman Catholicism and into the French language. The Dahomey gained partial independence, but were forced to join the French Union, a French version of the English Commonwealth. But a few years later, they seceded. They called themselves the Republic of Dahomey, but it was far from a stable nation, as they had amassed large amounts of debt, and there were many factions within the same borders. There were three main factions within the borders, and the first coup d'etat of the nation was led by one to usurp the other one from power, and it was successful. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, there were 4 coups. The final of these was led by a Marxist-Leninist supported by the Soviet Union. He proclaimed Dahomey a communist state, and renamed it to the People's Republic of Benin, even though the Kingdom of Benin was in modern-day Nigeria. Their flag was also horrid. Many purges followed this rise to power, and the nation's 6th coup d'etat occurred, backed by France, Morocco, and Gabon for the liberation of the people from communism, but it failed. The People's Republic of Benin followed in the footsteps of nearly all communist nations, as their government was poisoned with corruption and debt. The communist government slowly lifted its grip from the people, and finally held a committee with the leaders of many internal movements. At this committee, the leader of Benin expressed the failure of his ideology and of his government. It was here that Benin gained its modern constitution, and its name, the Republic of Benin, while also establishing a voting process. The first democratically elected leader formally apologized for Benin's participation in the slave trade, and all elections afterwards have been considered free and fair by the international community. Benin has never been a prominent nation internationally, but being under the constant rule of others, from the Oyo to the Soviet Union, it proves as a case study that the best way for a people to live is to be governed by themselves.